Okay, welcome everyone to our Chief Question and Answer Zoom session today. We're so happy to have all of you with us. This session is for our chiefs. Many of you are first-time chiefs in this election, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have as we lead up into the election. I'm happy to be joined by a number of our other staff today, including Abigail Peters, our election officer specialist for chiefs and assistant chiefs, Alina Selnick Escobar, our election officer coordinator who managed all of our training. We also have Jean Fauble, one of our trainers and staff members, Jean Tenson, one of our staff members, V. Wen, Nazila Refi, Kurt Mockenhaupt, and a number of other staff. And so they and I will take turns answering your questions today. To start, we're going to go over one of the things that we've received the most questions about, which is, let's make sure my slides can advance here, same-day registration. Now, for any of you who may have attended our chief workshops, which started last week, this is going to be very similar to information that was presented there. And if you hadn't had an opportunity yet to attend or enroll in a chief workshop, we encourage you to do so. So our chief workshops are optional, but highly encouraged for chiefs, and it gives you an opportunity to get hands-on practice with some of the things you may have to do as a chief, including dealing with non-routine voter situations, provisional ballots, and same-day registrations. So let's talk a little bit about same-day registration. So first, same-day registration will start in Virginia on October 18th, after the regular voter registration deadline. So from now until October 17th, anyone can register to vote in the normal method. They submit their voter registration, and then the Office of Elections will process it. But starting on October 18th, once that process ends, an individual can go to the Office of Elections, they can go to an early voting satellite location, or on November 8th, go to their polling place on election day and do a same-day voter registration there. So who is eligible to do a same-day registration? It's anyone who is not currently registered or anyone whose registration may not be up to date. What that means is if you've moved, you can do a same-day registration in your new precinct. What's important is that the voter, any voter who does a same-day registration, has to do it in the precinct in which they now live, because Virginia law requires you to vote in the precinct in which you would be registered or are registered. And so what will happen is, as chiefs, you're going to help voters and you'll have them do a voter registration application that has SDR up in the top right corner, as you can see in the image here. So how does the same-day registration voter actually vote? What they're going to do is two things. One, they're going to complete that voter registration application, and then you're going to turn that in with all your other chief materials. And then the voter will also do a provisional ballot. Why do they have to do a provisional ballot? Why can't they just cast their ballot on the machine? Well, we have not had an opportunity to verify and process their voter registration. We hope this isn't the case, but it's possible an individual may not be fully eligible to be registered to vote. So that's why we do the voter registration application, and then separately, the voter will do a provisional ballot. And once the Electoral Board reviews that provisional ballot and can see whether that voter was processed and registered or not shortly after Election Day, then that individual's provisional ballot would or would not be counted. And of course, we expect most people, if they do a valid voter registration, that their provisional ballot would likely be counted. So just to help you out a little bit, what would a same-day registration look like in practice? Well, the big question will be, has the voter shown up in the old precinct where they may have been previously registered, or their new precinct where they now live? So if they are in their so-called old precinct, then they may be eligible to vote routinely. And as a chief, you would review the moving conditions in the what ifs. If you've never been a chief before, or you've never had to use the what ifs before, don't worry. We're going to go over all that type of information in the chief basics class, which you may have already taken, or certainly in the chief's briefing in the lead up to this election. Now, if the voter is not eligible to vote anymore in their old precinct, maybe it's been too long since they've moved, then you would encourage them to go to their correct or new precinct, because that's where they could do a same-day registration. And so if the voter is in their new precinct where they now live, they would complete a same-day registration form and cast a provisional ballot. And also remember that if someone let's say someone moved sometime in the past 6 months, they actually have the option of either doing a same-day registration in their new precinct, or they could go back to their old precinct and vote on the machine there. Again, it's the voter's option, but we expect that most voters will probably take the option available to them at the location at which they go. So here's kind of a flow chart of the process, if this is helpful to you. So again, the first step is the voter completes the registration application. Next, the voter would provide an ID, and it's the same IDs that are acceptable for voting, including an ID confirmation statement. Then you as the chief would provide a provisional notice to them that just tells them all about the provisional process. They have that information. The voter would complete the provisional envelope, and the chief and the voter both need to sign that provisional envelope. You as the chief would add that voter to the provisional log and indicate that the reason code is number 6, which is other, and write SDR as the explanation for the other. The voter would complete and mark that ballot and then seal it in a small provisional envelope. And then you as the chief would place that ballot in the number 1A envelope. So it's very similar to the provisional practice in past elections. The one additional step is the voter needs to complete a registration application. So that's just a brief overview of the same-day registration process. And again, we're going to go through it in more detail in the chief's briefing that we do shortly before the election. So I want to assure all of you that the chief's briefing will cover all the information you need to know that is new or specific to this upcoming November's election. The chief briefing is about an hour long. It's a pre-recorded video, and we'll make it available to you 7 to 10 days before Election Day. And then what we'll do is some days after that, usually the Friday before the election, we will do another question and answer session like the one we're doing today to answer questions you may have after having watched that briefing. Now, for those of you here today, you may have questions about anything I've just said, or maybe a question relating to things in the Chief Basics class that you reviewed, or just questions in general. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my slide share here so I can see all of you. I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves so we can actually hear your questions. Feel free to raise your hand, use the Zoom feature to raise your hand so I can call on you so we can have a kind of an orderly discussion. Looks like we have about 75 of you here with us today, which is terrific. I'm really happy to see that. And of course, we're going to record and post this session online for anyone who's not able to join us live. So give me just a moment here. All right, so let's start taking your questions. So the first person I see that raised their hand using the Zoom feature is Thomas. Thomas, and as you ask your questions, go ahead and help us by identifying if you're a chief or a reserve chief so far for this election, and to which precinct you've been assigned.
Sure. Good afternoon.
And sorry, just one other note. And that's also a helpful reminder for any time you communicate with our office. If you send us an email or give us a call, feel free to identify yourself as the chief or reserve chief of X precinct, because that helps us out a little bit as well. Then we immediately know that you're chief when we're responding to your question, and we can go and find your record in our system a little bit faster. All right, so with that said, I apologize, Thomas. Go ahead, what's your question?
Okay, so I'm the chief of Precinct 845 Fountainhead down in South Fairfax County. So will it have the same moss-colored green envelope, or will it have a bright green or a bright pink? Is there going to be another way besides just writing number 6 SDR to differentiate these different ballots?
That's a great question.
And number 2, it's normally that we allow provisional ballots to go through that following Friday, which this year just happens to be Veterans Day. I'm not sure if Friday is a holiday or if that's going to be stretched out to Monday the 14th, in which case, what day are provisional ballots? What's the last day that they have to get their IDs and everything else into Fairfax County?
Sure. So let's take that in 2 parts. So for your first question, what is the color of the provisional envelope? So it'll be a, it's not lime green, it's kind of a slightly dark green envelope. For those of you that haven't served in the past year, what actually happened is in 2021, we stopped using the lime green no ID provisional envelopes because of the introduction of the ID confirmation statement. And so in 2021, across the entire county, across all voters that voted, I believe only 3 individuals chose to do a provisional ballot without an ID, because most individuals, if they didn't have an ID with them, chose to complete an ID confirmation statement. So if you're one of the lucky precincts that has a voter who would like to do a no ID provisional, there's just a no ID checkbox on the other green provisional envelope. So let me restate that just to make sure we're all on the same page. So if a voter not a same-day registration, but just if a voter in general needs to do a provisional ballot because they don't have their ID, there's a checkbox for the no ID. But we think that's a very small chance of happening because most voters who don't have an ID with them now would just do an ID confirmation statement. And let me take this as an opportunity to say that for me and for all of you serving as chiefs, we all have our own thoughts about the laws that are in place for the election. And just kind of, we have our personal opinions about them. But what's important is regardless of our personal opinions, mine or yours, about these things, I'm sure we all have thoughts about these things, our job is to carry out the laws as they're currently written. And if we don't agree with a certain law, then you can always write to the General Assembly or your member in the legislature to express that. But the laws as they stand right now do allow for voters to complete an ID confirmation statement in lieu of presenting an ID. So Thomas, your other question was about the time period for provisionals. So yes, the Friday after the election is Veterans Day, which pushes back all the legal deadlines to the next business day, which is the following Monday. So the Electoral Board will not complete the provisional adjudication process until the Monday after the election. Did I answer your questions? I'm going to hope that's a yes.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thomas. The next person I see with their hand raised in Zoom is Calvin. Looks like you're the chief of 801 Burke. Calvin, go ahead.
That's correct. Former assistant chief and now chief, so a step up for me. My question is for the SDR in practice slide. So you've asked us to get an ID for them or an ID confirmation statement. What are we to do with that step or that information if they're going to complete the voter registration application?
Good question. So for same-day registration, provisionals, other things, it's pretty similar to what we've done in the past, and those instructions will be in your Chief's notebook that you receive. It'll be in the Chief's briefing. But in short, provisional ballots are returned in the large number 1A envelope, and other documents like the voter registration applications are returned in the number 8 envelope. Part of that distinction is because the number 8 envelope can be opened on election night, so we can start reviewing the voter registration applications and processing them. There is one small thing that's changed, which is that in the past, the provisional ballot log, the paper form that had a list of all the provisional voters, was put inside the number 1A envelope. The Virginia Department of Elections has changed their guidance on that. They now instruct us and you to return that in the number 8 envelope. And again, it's so that we can start reviewing that shortly after the election is complete. Election day is complete, pardon me, because we need to process all those same-day registrations within a couple days of the election. So the state added additional requirements and processes for us, but did not push back the deadline to certify the election. So as the Office of Elections, we have to complete all processes and certify the election within 1 week of the election, the Tuesday after the election. All right. Let's see, I think the next person that has a question is David Lopez. David, go ahead.
Thank you, Robbie. David Lopez, Chief, Precinct 905, Franklin Middle School. My question is for same-day registration is about college students, and maybe that's not any different than any other voter, but my question is prompted by my own grandson who's a sophomore and hasn't registered to vote yet, and his home address, his residence address is in like Norfolk, but his college address is different. How does that affect, and what address does he use to do a same-day registration? And what's his precinct? What's the story there?
Sure. So for same-day registrations, in general, an individual needs to complete it in the precinct in which they now live. So for example, here in Fairfax County, we have a precinct 134 University, which is where the George Mason University campus is.
Right.
And so George Mason students that live on campus can do a same-day registration at that precinct's polling place on election day.
Okay.
David, for the situation involving your son, I would encourage him to give our office a call. There might be a little bit more possibly involved there, especially because individuals enrolled in college may have the option of either registering at home or at their college address. I'm not the voter registration expert. I'll be very forthright with you on that. But if they want to call us here in the office, we have a lot of folks who are experts on voter registration and can better answer that question. So if anyone has a question about voter registration questions, the number, it's the main number for our office. It's 703-222-0776. So let me repeat that. It's 703-222-0776. Again, that's our office's main number, and it's the voter registration staff that handle that phone number. But if you have questions about election day procedures, guidelines, the things that we're talking about here for the most part today, that's the number you may be more familiar with, 703-324-4735. My staff and I are the ones that answer that phone number. Can answer your questions on that one as well.
So just to be clear, so if I get a college student comes, I don't know why they would, to my precinct 905, but they're a George Mason student and they don't actually live on campus, or they would go to the precinct you talked about for George Mason to do a same-day registration?
If they live on campus, that would presumably be the precinct at which they need to do a same-day registration. What I'll do, Dave, is I will take that question to our voter registration staff, and I'll make sure that we address that in our chief's briefing so that everyone has that information as well. That's a great question. I just want to make sure we definitely know the right answer for that one for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think next we've got Frederick. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm the chief of 842 Parkway. I went through the briefing for chiefs and new chiefs, and it talked about the digital log for provisional ballots. I don't remember that from before. Where is it? How do we access it? Tell us a little bit more about that, please.
Sure. For that question, I'm going to ask my colleague, Gene Tenson, to answer that. So it sounds like your question is about the electronic provisional ballot log that will be on our new admin tablets. Gene, do you want to take that?
Sure. Frederick, the digital provisional ballot log is going to be on a special device that everyone's going to get called the admin tablet. It's a special type of iPad. It's not a poll pad. It has no poll pad software on it, but it will have things that you as the chief and the assistant chief will need during the day. And that provisional ballot log will be something that you'll fill out on the screen of that admin tablet. It will come with a keyboard, so it won't be just tapping on the screen. We've made it much more convenient for you to type those things in there.
Okay, is this the first election that we've used those, or were they used last November?
We used the digital ballot log, a version of it, in the June primary, but for most people, this November will be the first time that you're seeing that.
Yeah, I just didn't remember seeing it. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, next I think we've got Martha Miller. Go ahead. Martha, I think you're still muted.
With the digital tablet, what else is on it? It's pre-programmed on the digital tablet, and I have a second question too.
Sure, let me take that first one first, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So yes, every precinct will receive the new iPad, as Gene mentioned. It's called the admin tablet, and we're preloading a few different links on there. So one of the items on there will be the electronic provisional ballot log. So that's an exact copy of the paper provisional ballot log. And so what you would do on an election day is, as Gene said, you would record your provisional voter information on the paper log and then also copy it into the digital log. The reason we are asking you to do that is because there could be anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 provisional voters total this election, based on what we've seen in other states and other jurisdictions when same-day registration has been implemented. And we want to be able to export a spreadsheet with all the information so we can process that quickly in the 3 days after the election that we need to. In terms of other things that will be on there, we're going to take the turnout surveys that we've asked you to do in the past, perhaps on your personal phone, and we're going to load them on that admin tablet as well. So you won't need to use a personal device for anything. We're also going to take the process of, in the past, when you called in the results from your precincts on election night, and make that a form on the admin tablet. So you won't have to call anything in this time. As soon as you have your numbers ready, you type it in on the admin tablet, just like on that keyboard, as Gene said, you hit submit and you'll be good to go with that. So there won't be any more hold times or wait times on the phone anymore. We're also going to put a copy of the Chief's notebook on there. So you'll have a PDF copy in addition to the paper copy that you'll also receive. And we're looking at a few other tools that might be helpful to put on there as well.
Mhm.
With same-day registration, we're going to put a precinct lookup tool. So if you have a voter that comes in and they're not sure what their right precinct is, a way for them to be able to search, for you to search and figure that out. And we're looking at, there might be one or two other things that we're thinking of. We're hoping to make them work in time for election day. But if any of you have suggestions on things you'd like to see added on the admin tablet, feel free to let us know. Send us an email at electionofficers@fairfaxcounty.gov. This is the first election in which we're implementing the use of these tablets, and we're definitely open to suggestions for things that would be helpful to you. One thing we did take a look at is trying to digitize some of our other forms, like the chief's notes or the compensation sheet and things like that. For this election, we're going to stick with the paper forms. There are some challenges associated with those because of the information that has to be recorded, the signatures that are required, or just the fact that something has to be filled out throughout the day. But we're hoping that in the years ahead, we'll see if we can convert some of those onto the admin tablet as well, perhaps.
Mhm.
Martha, you said you had another question as well?
Right, regarding same-day registrations, if someone comes with an ID, without any address on it, let's say a voter could come with a student ID with a picture, university ID with a picture, but there'd be no address. And they could say they lived in the dorms. Let's say you happen to be in the dorm precinct, or they could say they're in your precinct, people rent places all over the place. Are we to ask for another form of address verification?
So that's a very good question. So again, I have my thoughts on this whole process and how it's been implemented. I'm sure you all do as well. The guidance that we received from the Virginia Department of Elections, and this is the way that every jurisdiction in Virginia will be handling this, is the individual completes a voter registration application. The voter registration application does not have an ID requirement associated with just that form in and of itself. Once they complete the voter registration form, then they're simply completing a provisional ballot. And you would ask for the same type of ID that any other voter would present. So if they provide an ID, let's say like a school ID that doesn't have an address on it, that would be
Mhm.
acceptable for any other voter, then we are required to accept that ID for the same-day registration process.
Okay, so there is no way to verify that they actually live in the precinct that they're coming to vote in.
Well, what will happen is the
In
information
some
that they put
cases,
on the voter registration application, they're completing that form under the threat of perjury, right? So that is a legal document. They are required
Mhm.
by law to be truthful and honest
Mhm.
in completing the voter registration application. And then it's
Mhm.
our office's job to then process that voter registration application.
Mhm.
And so that's just like any other voter. If a voter 4 weeks before election day submitted a voter registration application, we would process it. And if it was a valid and eligible registration, that individual would show up on the poll book. The only difference this time is you obviously can't make that determination on election day. So that's why the voter completes a provisional ballot.
Mhm.
But then our job in the office will be to process those registrations and then provide recommendations to the electoral board as to whether or not each ballot should or should not be counted for same-day registration voters.
So how do you verify addresses?
So our voter registration staff will follow the same process for same-day registration applications as they do for any other voter registration application. Again, I'm not the expert on that process, but I do know that they follow the same procedures that are prescribed by the State Department of Elections that all other jurisdictions in Virginia are required to do.
So we should talk to the registration people about.
You can, and what I'll try to do is I'll try to ask, well, I know for a fact that our voter registration supervisor will be on the Zoom call that we do after the chief's briefing shortly before election day. So I'm confident she'll be able to answer some of those questions for you and provide information about how we process voter registration applications. I do know that this question has come up in some of our recent electoral board meetings. So you're also welcome to go back and look at the minutes of some of the last electoral board meetings. And either in the minutes of those meetings or in the general registrar's report, it goes into more detail about how voter registrations are processed in accordance with the laws set in Virginia. So thank you very much for your questions, Martha. I really appreciate it.
Well, I have one more.
Sure,
If you
go
do
ahead.
sign the affirmation form, I'm new at this, so if you sign the affirmation form, it's a regular ballot. It's not a provisional ballot. Or is
So,
it a provisional ballot?
so it's,
A
let's make
person
sure we're,
doesn't have their ID, they do the affirmation form.
so let's make sure we're using the right terms. So for a voter that is on the poll book, if they show up to vote and they don't have an ID with them, it's not the
Mhm.
affirmation of eligibility, it'll be the ID confirmation statement. So that's the
Okay.
form that they could choose to complete if they would like. If they don't want to complete that form, they always have the option of doing a no ID provisional ballot and then providing a copy of their ID later. That's entirely the
Okay,
voter's
got
choice.
that.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, I think next we have Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
Hey, Robbie, Jeff Morrow, Frying Pan, 235. I think you've already answered my question. My question was, how are we going to verify that the person's in our precinct? But it sounds like this admin tablet has that lookup, correct?
That's right, yeah. So we definitely, this is obviously a big change here in Virginia. And so we want to make sure we provide you the tools required to look up each voter, make sure that if they're doing a same-day registration in your precinct, that they are in the correct precinct, I should say.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, that was my question, wondering how we're going to do that. But
Especially because we had a lot of folks who, they may be on their way to work. They may see a vote here sign outside of a polling place and pull in and think they can vote there. But as many of you may know, and as I said before, Virginia law requires you to vote in your registered precinct for the ballot to count. So yes, we will provide you the tools you need to verify that.
yeah, that's great, because I know like at Frying Pan, we have Florist Elementary a quarter mile away. We constantly get each other's voters confused. So that'll be helpful. And I applaud the addition of this admin tablet. That sounds like a great tool, especially not having to call in and wait. So thank you.
We're very excited about it too.
Yeah.
Did you have any other questions?
Nope, that's it. Thanks.
All right, great. Pamela, I see you're next.
Hi, Ravi. 607 Huntington is my precinct. My question is, how have we been doing in getting translators for different languages? I've actually been trying to recruit Korean speakers and some others. I've had no luck. We don't usually need something, but something comes up in a number of languages about one time in every election I've served. How are we doing on that side of things?
That's a wonderful question. So yes, for those of you that don't know, we are required in Fairfax County, based on our county demographics and based on, I think it's Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, to provide voter materials in 4 languages, English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Korean. So for those 3 additional languages, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Korean, we often provide language officers, individuals who are fluent in those languages, to precincts where we think there might be a number of voters who primarily speak those languages. So we're in pretty good shape on Spanish speakers. For Vietnamese and Korean speakers, we can always use more. Right now, we think we have our targets covered. We use about 20 to 30 precincts out of our 264 precincts have a target for those languages. But I'm going to take this opportunity to remind you all that we actually now have a referral bonus for language officers that speak Vietnamese or Korean. So if you know someone that speaks Vietnamese or Korean and is otherwise eligible to be an election officer, encourage them to apply, to mention your name, and we would pay you an additional $25 along with your regular election day stipend for that. The other thing I'll mention that's a little bit different this time is the decennial census process was completed earlier this year, and we were able to update all of our language targets based on that information. So it's once every 10 years, of course, but we were able to update our language targets and identify which precincts have the greatest need for these languages based on hard census data, which was terrific. So we hope if in the past we haven't provided you a language officer, but you had a need, that you do now. Or in some cases, there were precincts where we'd been sending out language officers who would tell us, no one ever shows up speaking these languages. And based on census data, we were able to confirm that and to adjust those targets. Any other questions, Pamela?
Okay. Yes, just a quickie. I can't quite remember how we might have handled this in the past. What happens if you get someone in whose language is Amharic or Mandarin? You don't, they're on the polls, but you can't communicate with them on how to fill out the ballot. How do we handle that?
So I'm going to ask my colleague, Jean Fauble, to chime in on this one. Jean's been a chief many times. She's one of our trainers and one of our staff members here.
Thank you.
Hi, that's a good question. So we do have information. The county contracts with a language interpreter phone line service called Liberty Language Service. And there is information in the chief's notebook in the during the day tab that gives the information about how you call this language interpretation phone service, what the PIN number is that shows that we're Fairfax County, and then some guidance from this service about how you talk to them, how you get the voter to get the translation for the languages that that need interpretation. So there is information in the chief's notebook that runs you through and has the information about if you have voters who need language assistance who aren't one of the other 3 languages that which we have the language officers. Does that answer your
Okay.
question?
Yes, indeed. Thank you
Oh,
very much.
good. So Ravi, do you want to take it on from here?
Yes, we'll go
Okay.
to our next person. Before that, I actually have Beth Methvessel, the clerk of the electoral board, here speaking to me. So she wanted me to take this opportunity to remind all of you that if you are assigned to a co-located precinct, so that's a situation where we have one building, let's say Centerville High School, that has 2 precincts contained within it, that you definitely want to coordinate with your other chief to communicate with the school or the building and to plan things out. Like you might be able to share signs and things. So what we will do as the Office of Elections is 1 or 2 weeks before Election Day, we'll let you know who the other chief is, their contact information, all of that. So just an early reminder that if you're assigned to one of those locations, to coordinate with that other individual. Beth, anything else to add? Okay. Thanks, Beth. All right, so I see, looks like Sean. Sean, go ahead, you're next.
Okay, thank you. So I'm a chief at Laurel, precinct 119. And my question was similar to the man whose son was a university student, but pertaining to all people who come in to register on the same day. I understand that their ballot is then provisional, but what happens with their voter registration? Are they able to vote normally from then on, or does the elections board check them out to make sure that their addresses are correct, or how does that work?
Sean, let me make sure I understood your question. Were you asking, so if someone does a same day registration, how does it affect them in elections after that one? Is that correct?
Yes, because
Okay.
their first ballot is provisional, but then what happens in subsequent elections?
That's a terrific question. So when someone does a same day registration, they are
Yes.
completing a standard voter registration application. We process at our office processes after Election Day. And once it's processed and if it's eligible and valid, then they are a registered voter. So in that first election, they would have done a provisional ballot, but then in subsequent elections, they're just like any other voter on the poll books. And they would not need to do that same day registration process again. So that same day registration process is, as the Commissioner of Elections of Virginia has stated, it's an emergency process, right? We want most people to register more than 3 weeks before Election Day using the standard process. But if an individual is not able to do that for some reason, they do a same day registration, but it accomplishes the same thing. It gets them registered. But if you're talking to your friends or family, you definitely want to encourage them to register to vote before the voter registration deadline, which is October 17th, because that way they will be on the poll book. And when they show up to vote, they'll be able to mark their ballot and scan it on the DS200. If they're doing a same day registration, they will not be able to put that ballot in the scanner, and it's considered a provisional ballot.
Okay,
Sean,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nope, I was going to say, I hope I answered your question, but if you have any other questions, happy to answer them.
Actually, my question is, so they're automatically put into the poll book, or does somebody check to make sure? Because I think when we register ahead of time, isn't there some checking that goes on, or is it just always taken at face value that somebody registers in there?
So when, right, so when a voter comes in, or someone, I guess, who's not a registered voter yet, comes in on election day and does a same day registration, they will not show up on your poll pad at all. What we'll do is you'll collect that paperwork, you'll turn it into us, and starting the day after the election, or even possibly election night after 7 p.m. as we get materials back, we'll start processing them, but they'll be on the poll book the next election.
Next election.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Because we still need to do the full review process of that application to make sure it's valid.
Okay, so the same process happens. It just happens after the election instead of before.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That was my question. Thank you.
Martha, it looks like you got another question.
She's muted.
Regarding the translators, they would work a full day, just like usual. Just they would be a real election officer. And then, is that correct? And do we know how many, like, for our own precincts, which languages would be important in that precinct? I know you mentioned you had it as a resource, but I'm not sure if we know that.
Sure. So let me ask Jean Fauble again if she wants to chime in on this.
So with respect to officers who are assigned within the category of a language officer, they would act at the precinct and do all the other election officer functions as officers who do not have that language officer designation. So if their services are needed, like you have a voter who comes in and really needs some assistance with, just understanding things and speaking with someone in their native language, the language officer would assist as a language officer at that point. But they come in for the full day, they do all the same functions, they help with opening, they help with closing, and so they are election officers in every other way, but they have this extra ability they're able to add to your precinct because they are a language officer in the designated language. Does that answer it? Okay, good.
Okay, thank you.
All right, looks like we've got David next. Go ahead.
Thank you, Robbie. Again, Chief at 9:05. Something that came up in a equipment familiarization session that we had up there at the Government Center was an example of an ID that goes into the poll pad, the poll book, and it comes back federal only voter. They told us we could call in about that, but can you talk to what constitutes that issue?
Sure. So there are certain situations in which an individual just may be a federal only voter, in which case they would only be eligible to vote on federal contests. So in this coming election, in 261 of our 264 precincts, the only contest on the ballot will be for a member of the Federal House of Representatives, which is a federal contest. So even if you have a federal only voter this election, in all of those precincts, they're going to get the same ballot as anyone else. And that's what the poll pad will tell you. The only exception to that, the 3 precincts that are in the town of Herndon, because Herndon is having a town election this year. So in addition to having a ballot with House of Representatives, their ballot will also include contests for mayor of Herndon and I think town council. So that's the situation and how you would handle it for a federal only voter. It's pretty rare. You don't get very many federal only voters, but essentially that they would have a separate ballot that only has federal contests on it. And I'm glad to hear you attended one of our equipment practice sessions recently. So let me take this opportunity to make a plug for Alina that we have those going on this week, next week, and at some other times. And those are kind of an open house session. It starts with an overview of some poll pad procedures. Those are mandatory for all of our first-time officers. But if any of you just want to get some practice with the various voting equipment, the poll pads, the Express for the DS200, you're welcome to sign up for one of those and attend. So thanks for your question, David.
No, I just want to say thank you for doing these sessions. These are great because invariably as they're studying and going through things, questions pop up, and it's great to have you have these on the schedule so that we can ask these questions and hear what everybody else is wondering about and asking about too. So thank you.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, we've tried our best to provide a range of opportunities, right? If you're able to come in person, we've got our chief workshops, we have our equipment practice sessions. If you're not, we have Zooms like this one today. And remember, you're always welcome to give us a call or send us an email for any other questions, and we're happy to answer them. All right, next, Thomas, go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Robbie. Tom Hugh, Precinct 845. You mentioned you're expecting could be 5,000 provisional ballots county-wide. So worst case scenario, I'm thinking of a lineup from 6:45 till 7:15 at night of all these people who suddenly want to do a same day registration and everything else. We've never had that in the precinct before, but what could possibly go wrong? Obviously, the old rules, if you're inside the precinct building, the voting booth, the voting location, at 7 o'clock, when I call the polls are closed, those voters in line still get to vote. And so I would assume these people who are standing in line and trying to fill out SDRs and all the paperwork involved with that, they will have their opportunity to vote as well. It's just going to take a little longer to get all the processing done. And the last election I worked was last November. And I think the Office of Elections was pushing the chiefs to have the reports back to you, the results, by 8 o'clock in the evening. There's going to be a whole lot of stuff going on trying to get these SDRs, because human nature, people are going to wait till the last minute and, hey, I think I'll vote, and I'll just whip out the SDR. So there'll be pressure to get that done, pressure to get the rest of the poll reports done and everything else. How do you envision the workload at the Office of Elections?
Sure. So let's take that in 3 parts. So the first part was about the number of provisionals that we may see. So I'll take that in a second. Second one was about how you handle, provisional voters at the end of the day. I'm going to ask Gene Tenson to chime in on that in a moment. And the third part was about, when we ask you to report your results on election night and the timing of that. So let's start with that last one. So in the past, we've always asked that you call in your results as soon as possible after the polls close, right? That you complete the part of the SOR that has that information and then give it to one of your officers and ask them to call it in. So 2 things are going to make that process much easier this time. So number 1 is the statement of results has been significantly updated. We changed it earlier this year to make it a lot simpler than it has been in the past. And everywhere that it asks you to do things like add this number to this number to this number, then subtract this number from this number, then add this number, then subtract it all from this, that's all gone. All we're asking you to do now is in a couple sections, write down these 4 or 5 numbers and then add them up. And that's it. So we think that's going to be a lot simpler to do that, which should save you some time when you then need to report those numbers. The second part of that is, as we said, you no longer have to call in those numbers. You'll be able to just type them in on your admin tablet. So there's no hold time. Now, all that said, I don't want any of you to feel pressured to do that so quickly that it compromises your ability to close the polls properly. Your most important duty is to take your time to do that process right, and then to transmit that information to us as soon as convenient after that. So that was the third part of your question.
Yeah.
The first part was about how many provisionals and same-day registrations could we possibly expect this election. So let me put this in context. A year ago, in the November 2021 election, we had about 2,500 provisional ballots countywide. So based on that, based on the fact that this year's election is expected to be, in terms of turnout, we think it may be similar or a bit lower than last year. We think it'll be a comparable number of provisionals that are not same-day registrations, about 2,500 regular provisionals. Well, how much more will same-day registration add to that? Many folks in the office think maybe it'll double that number from 2,500 to 5,000. When we look at other states, sometimes it's gone higher than that. So we are preparing for the possibility of up to 25,000 provisionals countywide. And we're going to provide each of you, I believe it's 150 provisional envelopes for each precinct, which is actually about 40,000 countywide. Essentially, we have to prepare for the worst case scenario, but most likely we think it'll be maybe double of what it was a year ago. That's what many folks in in our office think based on the information we have. Now, for the other part of your question about how to handle a line of same-day registration voters or any voters in general, let me turn that over to Jean for a moment.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Thomas. Any voter who is in line at 7 o'clock, whether that line is still inside your building or has stretched out into the parking lot, will be eligible to vote. And if that includes someone who is a same-day registrant, you would process them through the same-day voter registration process, just like you would somebody who showed up at 10 a.m. You'll just keep processing those people in the normal provisional way that you did at any other time during the day.
Sure. And I understand that. It's just, when we've had provisional voters in the past, they tend to come mid-afternoon or things like that. By the end, it's just the folks on their way home from work who are supposed to be voting in the precinct, who show their ID, and takes, bing, bang, boom, and they're done and out. And, by 7:05, we're finished. I just thought, heaven forbid, if we have all these folks who need extra handling, of course we would handle them as we did all day long. It just could be that much longer because it's a more involved process, as Robbie said, to do it carefully and correctly.
We
Okay.
hear you.
Yep, this is good stuff. Thank you.
All right, looks like next person, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Renee. Renee, do you have a question for us? It looks like you're unmuted, but I'm not hearing anything.
I think it's Renata.
We're not, okay. We can come back in a moment. If you want to take a moment to resolve any technical issues. Looks like Pamela, you're next.
Hi, sorry to take up more time. I know our policy has changed on this over the years. Could you confirm what our policy is regarding people taking photographs in the polling station and wearing political t-shirts or political hats, that sort of thing?
Sure. So let's take this in two parts. So for voters, voters are allowed to wear whatever they want when they go to vote. And in terms of taking photographs, they can take a photograph of themselves or others, but only if they have the permission of those individuals, right? So if you have, let's say, a mother and a daughter that want to take a selfie together, that's okay as long as they both consent to that. What's not okay is a voter taking a picture of all the other voters voting at that time. So that's something just to be aware of and be careful of. Now, those are the rules governing voters. It's a little bit different for authorized representatives or poll watchers. Authorized representatives, poll watchers, are not allowed to take any photographs in the polling place during the entire day. This is something we actually had to double check for a recent question. So at any point throughout the day that someone is serving as an authorized representative, which can include during opening procedures, during closing procedures, they are not allowed to take any photographs. And they're also not allowed to wear campaign paraphernalia or anything that might influence a voter. Any other questions?
No, that's good. Thank you.
All right, great. Sean, you're next.
Okay, just another question about the provisional ballots. I'm sure this probably won't come up, but what happens if you run out of them and have actually more than if we have more and people coming in same day registration than we have provisional ballots for?
Sure. So remember, it's two separate items. One are the ballots. The ballots used for provisional voters are the same ballots used for anyone else. They're not marked provisional or different anyway. It's simply that instead of being scanned on the machine, they get enclosed in a provisional envelope. And then we have the envelopes. So for the ballots, what I can tell you is that countywide, we've ordered enough ballots for at least 65% of active registered voters of every precinct, which we think is going to be more than enough. Because a year ago, in-person voting was on average 37% in precincts. So we've ordered almost 30% above that for all precincts. But then we went one step further for the precincts that did have the highest in-person turnout a year ago, as well as all the precincts that were newly created as a result of redistricting, for which we don't have data a year ago. And for precincts in the 10th congressional district, which is expected to have the most competitive election, we went up to 75% ballot order. So we don't think any of you are going to run out of ballots anytime soon on election day. In terms of provisional ballot envelopes, like I said, my colleague Kay Garrison, our inventory and supply manager, she and her team are working hard to give you all about 150 envelopes each. We think that'll be more than sufficient, because on an average basis, we have 264 precincts. So even if we had 25,000 provisional voters, which again is on the astronomically high side of what we think it could be, that would only take about 100 provisional ballot envelopes per precinct. So we think we've given you more than enough. But if for some reason your precinct has a really high number of provisional voters, the most important thing is to notify your rover or our office as soon as possible of that, so we have time to get you more provisional envelopes.
Okay, that's what I thought. Then also, one more thing is, I think in the past, the provisional have been a different color than the regular ballots, have they not? I know they go in a different colored envelope, but were they not a different color themselves, the provisional ballots?
No, the ballots, like I said, it's the exact same ballots you issue to any other voter, which is
Okay.
why it's so important as a chief for all of you to make sure that when you're assisting a provisional voter, that you're doing that at the chief's table and that you are staying with that person the entire time. Maybe it's you, maybe it's the assistant chief, but staying with that voter so they don't accidentally walk over and cast it on the machine.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that.
Sure thing. I don't see anyone else with their hand raised right now. So I'm going to take a moment to just kind of go through the chat. I saw that some questions came in there. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand in the meantime. So let me pull up the chat here. Scroll all the way to the beginning. So I see a question about IDs and utility bills and just basically what types of IDs are acceptable. So again, any type of ID that is acceptable for voting normally is an acceptable ID for the provisional process as well. And we did clarify that with the State Department of Elections. We thought there might be some differences with same-day registration, but they've told us the same IDs that a voter would present to vote normally must be accepted for the same-day registration process as well. Let's see. We had a question about who makes the software for the admin tablet. So the admin tablets, they are just a regular iPad, just like one you would go and buy from the Apple Store. And then all we've done is put a few links to web apps on there. So it's, for example, links to the 3 turnout surveys you do on election day, a link to the formula to put in the election night numbers, a link for the precinct locator tool, a link for the Chief's Notebook PDF, things like that. So there's no special software on there. Question from Paul, does the Chief's table have both an admin tablet and a standard poll pad? In general, yes. So precincts this election will receive between 3 to 5 poll pads. And of those 3 to 5 poll pads, they're all configured in the same way, but you as the chief can choose to have one of those at the chief's table to help you with non-routine voters. And then in addition to that, every precinct will receive one admin tablet. And then yes, the admin tablet would stay at the chief's table. And as Jean said, they have a hardware keyboard with them. So you don't have to worry about typing on a screen. You can type, just the way you normally would on any other computer. William from 201 Armstrong asked, what do you do when somebody shows up and they show as they've already voted? Jean, would you like to take that? Either Jean?
Sure. So if someone shows up and they give you their name and you pull up their record and it has green across and it says voted, the most likely explanation is that one of your election office poll pad officers accidentally checked in the wrong voter. At this point, that voter who's shown as having already voted will have to fill out a provisional ballot. And the situation might be where you have 2 people living in the same household, and one's Victor Richards and another one is Victor Richards Jr. The son may have been checked in place of the father, and the father says, well, I think my son came earlier today and he may have been checked in for myself. What you can do to assist the electoral board in adjudicating the ballot is to write an explanation for what you think might have happened on the outside of the provisional ballot envelope or on a little piece of that little notepad paper and staple it to the outside of the envelope, explaining what you think happened. You will also have to use all your diplomatic skills in dealing with this voter. And then that voter will have to vote routinely. I mean, vote in a provisional way. And then to counteract this possibility, each time you have a new shift of poll pad officers just starting out on the poll pads, you or the assistant chief should oversee for the first like 5 minutes or maybe less to make sure they understand how to properly search for, identify, and check in your voters to prevent situations like this from occurring. And I hope I answered your question.
And Jean, let me take a moment to follow up on that last point you just said, which is really, really important for all of you as chiefs. At the beginning of the day at 6 a.m. when the polls open or when you have a shift change, definitely monitor your check-in officers and make sure they are checking in voters properly. It's rare, but it happens that we see some precincts, very, very small number, where it'll be usually one individual who, they'll find a voter, they'll press the button to open the voter's record, they'll go to the next screen, but then instead of hitting that final check-in button, they say go back to the voter search screen. In one situation a couple years ago, we had an individual who didn't check in, I think it was about 40 voters properly. Suffice to say that individual is not back as an election officer. But what I'm asking all of you as chiefs to do is to make sure all of your election officers check in their first voter of the day properly and that you visually see that for yourself so that you know that they know how to do it properly. All right, let me go through some of the other questions I saw in the chat, and then I see that some of you have your hand raised, and I'll come back to you. Janine asked, will we still be required to complete the 3 turnout surveys during the day? And will those responses be recorded on a personal device or on the new admin tablets? So yes, we are still going to ask you to do the 3 turnout surveys on election day at 9 a.m., 12 p.m., and 3 p.m. And you'll be able to do those on the admin tablet now that we have that for all of you. I got a question from Pamela about, as an Android user, is there anything new for me to learn on the admin tablets? So yes, the admin tablets are an iPad, an Apple-based device. We hope they're pretty easy to use, but feel free to let us know if you have any questions, or you may just have another officer in your precinct that can help answer those for you as well. Amy Jacobs said, the Office of Elections has done a great job simplifying the SOR first, so I appreciate that. We used that for the first time in the June election, which was a Democratic primary. But if any of you want to take a look at it, it is on our training website right now. And then also, Amy noted that if you have lots of people in line at 7 p.m., then requesting that we have info back to the Office of Elections by 8 p.m. is really unrealistic. So like I said earlier, I totally get that. Your first and most important priority is processing your voters correctly. So definitely keep your focus and attention on that and then provide the information to us as you can. In general, what we've asked in the past is for you to report your results by 8 p.m. and to ideally be closed with your precinct by 9 p.m. But obviously, if you have a long line at 7 p.m., that will impact that, and we understand that completely. Let's see if there's anything else here. I see that David asked a question about how we're going to verify the eligibility of individuals who do a same-day voter registration form. Again, I'm going to check with my voter registration colleagues and provide that information to you during the Chiefs briefing Q&A. I see a question from Mila about if someone on the poll pad is flagged as someone for whom you need to verify an ID, is the ID confirmation statement a ID that they could choose? In general, the answer to that is no. So there are a small number of voters, they're called HABA voters, and there will be a prompt on the poll pad if this comes up, that for those individuals, you do need to see a photo ID for them. And the poll pad will tell you which IDs are acceptable for that. So it's a very small subset of voters, it's pretty rare, and the poll pad will tell you everything you need to know if you have that situation for a particular voter. I see that James asked, will election officers take a poll pad out to vehicles for use in processing curbside voters? So yes, that's something we changed about a year ago, and we said, yes, you do have permission to take a poll pad outside with you to check in a curbside voter. Please obviously be careful not to drop that device, or especially if there is bad weather outside, if it's raining or something, then either you can follow the old procedures when you don't take the device out or have an umbrella with you or something. Christopher asked, has the election office sent out the list of election officers for precincts? Not to you as chiefs. So we've sent out assignments for most precincts, for most officers in the past week. We're in the process of confirming those assignments, and we'll have some folks that, they'd never confirmed their assignment or they declined their assignment. We'll get all of that ironed out in the next couple of weeks. And then we will send all of you as chiefs, your precinct rosters about 2 weeks before Election Day. Looks like a lot more questions came in the chat. So Tom said, you can always call the government center for support on Election Day. Yeah, absolutely. And you'll be put in touch with the right person that can give you the information you need. James has a question about out-of-state students and same-day registration. Again, that's something I want to get a little bit more information from my colleagues in voter registration about, and we'll address in the briefing. And Richard asked us the last question here before we go back to the individuals with their hands raised. If we are scrambling to close because of unexpected last-minute long lines and might miss the 8 p.m. SOR submission, do you want to call or text stating that we are not ignoring the reporting requirement? So no, we don't need any notification. We get it. We may give you a call just to see how things are coming along and if there's anything we as an office can do to help you, or if we should send a rover out to assist you. But I really don't think it'll take you till 8 o'clock in most cases, because I don't think you're going to see a very long line at 7 o'clock. What we've seen historically is not just for same-day registration, but voters in general tend to vote earlier in the day. And that's when we expect most people to come in. So I don't think any of you have cause for concern. But again, if you do have a long line at 7 p.m., it's always possible. We saw that in the presidential election, but we don't see it otherwise usually. Then take your time to handle that correctly. All right, looks like Renee, you've got your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hey, can you hear me this time?
Yes, and also, how do you pronounce your name? Because I want to make sure I get that right. Renata.
Yeah,
should have listened to the other person who said that. Sorry.
I just wanted to chime in for a second because 2 years ago, I worked at the George Mason University precinct, and that was a huge turnout. And we had many students come to just check in as a voter, and they did not have the correct address when they were giving us their information. And it turns out that it was 2 years ago that every student at George Mason was registered with the exact same address. It's not the place where they live, it's a university-wide address. So that needs, I was very concerned for the students because a lot of them were first-time voters and they were quite nervous. And I didn't think George Mason did as good of a job as they should have to educate their students. And we did have a couple of instances where the student felt that we were trying to keep them from voting. You know what I mean? So, so definitely check in if you are working at the university precinct. Be prepared for that. A lot of the students did not have the correct address. Sometimes they were off by a digit on the address, and it was very concerning. And they're kids, they're young.
Right. Yeah, I remember that, dealing with some of that in the office. So I can say two things. One, the same-day registration process will take care of a lot of student situations that, whereas in the past they may not have been able to vote based on their registered address, that the same-day registration process will give them the opportunity to update their voter registration. But two, our general registrar has also indicated that we are going to send a office staff member out to that precinct to assist with some of those situations. So if you, Renata, or anyone else is assigned to that precinct on the George Mason University campus, we'll have office staff there to help with a lot of the tough situations as well.
Very good.
Right. Yes. Eric, you're next.
Yeah, I have two questions, actually. The first one is, do we have an indication or inclination from the parties on how many poll watchers we may have this election?
So we're still a ways away from the election. So they give me some preliminary information, but it's obviously very subject to change. But we think we will see authorized representatives, poll watchers, in 30 to 50% of precincts.
Okay. And my other question has to do with the statement of results and the printouts from the DS200. is there a possibility of making the cut lines much more obvious, like X's above and O's below, so you can put a scissors down between them?
Oh, how I wish that was a possibility. Unfortunately, the software used for this, it is standardized election software used by thousands of election jurisdictions across the country. And unfortunately, as best as I know, it does not give us that option. We've looked into it. We wanted to make it a little bit easier. I do know that I think it was about a year ago, we changed it so that the information on the tapes prints in a larger font size. So it is a bit easier to at least read now. But no, I wish we could give you, very clear dotted lines with instructions for where to cut, but it doesn't do that right now.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Pamela, go ahead. You're muted right now.
Okay, sorry about that. Are the check-in officers at the poll pads required to still call out the name and address of voters?
No, not the address.
So the law changed, can't remember if it was 1 year ago or 2 years ago. Check-in officers are required to repeat the voter's name, but not the address.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Looks like we've got our last 3 questions and then we'll call it a day. Diane, go ahead.
If on the off chance that the standard of results from the DS200 don't match what the total is for the poll pads, I know that, we're working to make sure people submit everything correctly on the poll pads, but what would be the process to fix that?
So I'm gonna ask my colleague Jude Tenson to chime in on this. Let me make sure I understood your question. Is your question, what do you do if the number of voters checked in on the poll pads doesn't match the number of ballots cast on the DS200?
Yes.
Okay. Jean, do you want to take that?
Sure. That's something that you will want to try to explain on the SOR. We have a box there where we say, if you have any idea what might have gone wrong during the day, at least give it a shot to explain what might happen. There's 2 most common ways that can happen. The first is if an election officer does not totally complete the check-in process. So they wouldn't be checked in, but they would have cast a ballot. So you might have the DS200 is 1 higher than the poll pads. Another less common situation is what we call a fleeing voter, where they've been checked in. They go sit down and start filling out their ballot, but maybe there's an emergency and they have to leave. And they leave their ballot in the ballot marking area. Or maybe they're just in a big hurry. They put their ballot in and run out the door. And for some reason, that ballot cannot be scanned by the scanner. That's where you would have one more checked in than you had on the scanner. So if you see situations like that happen during the day, try to make a note in your chief's notes, and then you'll have that when it's time to explain it on the SOR. And if you really have no idea why it's off by 1 or 2, just write, we don't know what happened.
Thank you.
Usually when we do these Zooms, by the time we're an hour in, we've lost 20 or 30% of the people. They got their question answered and they've left. I see we actually have slightly more people now than we did when we started. So I hope that means we're providing you good, helpful information that's answering your questions. Heather, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm first-time chief at Sandy Run, which means I'm going to be co-located with Fountain Head. So am I going to be able to get that information so I can meet that other chief, because we're going to be co-located?
So yes, we will provide you that information around the same time we send you your precinct roster, about 2 weeks before Election Day. That will provide you the co-located precincts information. By the way, you said you're the chief of 860 Sandy Run, is that right?
Yes.
Congratulations. That's one of our brand new precincts that resulted from the redistricting process. So you will be the first chief to ever work in that precinct.
Heather, that is me over in 845, Tom Hugh. So we'll be coordinating throughout the day, even leading up to the day. So
okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Got
Oh, that's fun how that worked out. Terrific. Let's see, Martha, go ahead.
I have one more question on the student voters, or I guess anyone, but more or less student, because they would have a ID and be local maybe without an address on it. So what if they voted absentee in their home precinct, which could be Virginia Beach, Richmond, wherever, and then wanted to vote same-day registration here? Would you be cross-checking with state registrars?
That's a wonderful question. And I'm really glad you brought that up because that gives me an opportunity to explain this. So a funny thing in Virginia, you only get to vote once. So
I
once an
understand that.
individual, yes. So once an individual has voted, and that includes a provisional ballot, right? So even if someone did a provisional ballot, let's say before election day, maybe a same-day registration at one location, then they go to another location and want to vote there. One, they shouldn't, and usually they can't do that. We'll see that in the poll books for the most case. So number one is you only get to vote once. Number two is how do we reconcile that information? How do we make sure that someone doesn't do a same-day registration at one point and then a regular ballot on another time, or an absentee or anything like that? So for individuals who are doing same-day registrations before election day, those registration forms are coming back to our office on a regular basis. We're processing them and putting those individuals on the poll books marked as this person has done a same-day registration, so that hopefully by election day, you'll know if someone has done that and they won't be able to come in and vote again. So the same way, if someone requests an absentee ballot before election day and that shows up on the poll pad on election day, you'll see that. But we, as a state, have gone one step further. I actually served on the work group that the State Department of Elections had for same-day registration. And one of the processes we decided to implement was, how do you make sure someone doesn't do a same-day registration in two different counties in Virginia, for example? So what the state is going to do is they are going to, so after election day, in the 2 or 3 days, that Wednesday, Thursday, Friday after election day, every jurisdiction will put in all their same-day registrations into the state voter database, and we'll mark them as same-day registrations. Then the state is going to do a check for us to see, did any individual do a same-day registration in multiple places? And then those offices will be able to review and coordinate and see what needs to happen in those situations. So we'll make sure that no one has a same-day registration ballot counted twice in two different localities in Virginia. So the state has given some thought to how we maintain the security of the voting process, because it's very important that we have confidence in the voting system, and that there is, integrity in that system, and we expect to see that. All right, so our
one little related question is,
Sure.
are you counting absentee ballots as they come in? Someone asked me that in the community. In other words, let's say all the early absentee ballots and the early voting ballots that are going to start soon, do they get counted by let's just Fairfax County for now? Are you starting to count them immediately?
So the absentee process is kind of complicated. And I'm not the expert on that. We have other folks that are, and they'll be on that final Zoom we do before election day to answer some of those questions. In general, what happens is, starting this Friday, September 23rd, that's the start of the absentee voting process period, right? So we are going to mail out ballots to anyone who's requested an absentee mail ballot. We also open 3 early voting satellite locations on Friday at the Fairfax County Government Center, the North County Governmental Center, and the Mount Vernon Governmental Center. And for individuals who are mailed a ballot, let's say within a week, they mail it back to us. What we do as an office is we will check that into the voter registration system. So we'll be able to say, we have now received this voter's ballot, but we don't open the envelope and scan it. That process doesn't happen until give or take a week before election day. And the Virginia Department of Elections requires all localities to start that process. I believe it's the Monday that's a week before election day is when all localities have to start doing that. But there are, we follow the state laws and guidelines on this process. But we are not opening and scanning ballots, 45 days before the election.
So that's how you would know that someone voted absentee already. It would show up on our poll pad for one of our precinct people.
Right. We would know that they returned their absentee ballot.
Right.
We wouldn't know how they voted or anything like that, obviously.
No. Okay.
Good question. All right. I know we've been going for, looks like about 75 minutes. So yeah, we'll do Tom, then Richmond, then Calvin, and then we'll call it a day. So go ahead.
Real quick, just technique only, but for, I think it was Diane who was asking about discrepancies between the poll pads and the DS200 results. What we do in our precinct, I've been the assistant chief there for about 14 elections. But we go through periodically, like every half hour or hour, and I just do a comparison between the total counts, the poll pad count, and add up the 2 DSRs if we're using 2 of them, and kind of count noses of people who are still voting, and the numbers should even out, and so you have a pretty good indication all day long. And as Jean pointed out, there are mistakes that happen. Somebody forgets to finish the check-in process or things like that, or fleeing voters, but you will know pretty, within 99% certainty when you're coming to the end of the day, if you have some discrepancies or not. Technique only.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I did the same thing in my precinct when I was a chief for a number of years, that I would constantly throughout the day be checking those numbers, because if they ever don't match up, I want to know when it happened, and then I can try and figure out why it happened. So what we've actually done starting, I think it was this past June's election, is we've now created a new form that we are going to ask all of you to complete, where once every hour on the hour, right? So at 6 a.m., 7 a.m., 8 a.m., 9 a.m., to just go and look at those numbers. How many people are checked on the poll pads? How many ballots cast in the DS200? And do you have any voters that are currently in the process of voting? Because that could be a reason why those numbers don't exactly match up. And when you look at those 3 numbers, let's say you have, 100 people checked on the poll pads, you have 5 people currently voting, and you have 95 ballots cast on the DS200, then all your numbers check out together. And that way you can just kind of check off, as of this time on election day, we know everything was good. And that'll help you identify if there's an issue. And for example, let's say you're in a precinct where a check-in officer is not checking in voters properly, you would know that very quickly, and not, well into the day of the election. So yeah, that's a new form. We hope it's not too onerous for you to do. And actually, you can ask one of your high school pages to help with that. That's definitely a form that they can assist with, but that's something we want everyone to do.
Yeah.
All right, Richmond, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question and then an observation or question. One is if the poll pads and the DS200 don't match because the poll pad the officer didn't complete the check-in process, doesn't that pad not allow the officer to check in anyone else until that first one is completed?
So good question. Jean Tenson, do you want to chime in on this one?
Yes and no. You can be checking in somebody on the poll pad and get to partway through it. There's 2 steps where you have to tap. I think it's submit and then accept, or accept and then submit. If you get to, and you do just one of those steps, you could then just hit the go back button or the home button and not complete the check-in. So there isn't some kind of like a hard stop there that would prevent you from going back once you had started.
Let me say this, when we saw this start happening, we saw this in one of the elections during the height of the pandemic, when we were doing, all online training, and some folks hadn't had an opportunity to practice on the equipment. And I went back after the election, like, how is this possible? How do we have a few people doing this? And the button they had to press, and I think it actually even says cancel check-in or cancel process or something. I would hope that most people understand that if you press cancel, then you're not actually checking in the voter. But that's one of the reasons why we implemented a mandatory requirement for all first-time officers to come in and get hands-on practice with equipment, practice checking in voters, so we don't see an issue like that ever again.
So what you're saying then is that it would be most unusual, or it should be most unusual, for someone not to complete that check-in and then go on and try to check in someone else.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And then the second thing I wanted to ask you was way all the way back to the beginning, where you were talking about the SDRs. When we complete the SDR, there's 2 documents that we now have, the registration and a provisional ballot. And I think I may have gotten mixed up on where you say we put those. One goes into the 1A, which is the chief's material, and one goes in another document. Which was which, another envelope? Which was which, please?
Sure. So let me preface this by saying what I'm about to say, none of you need to remember this because it will be written down in your chief's notebook. And it'll be in there. You'll have the instructions, you'll have checklists for where to return different items. But the short of it is the provisional ballot envelopes, those small green envelopes, will be returned in the large 1A envelope, as they always have. The voter registration forms and the paper provisional ballot log will be returned in the number 8 envelope. So everything is being returned in the same place it was, with one exception, which is that provisional ballot log, the list of all the provisional voters, used to come back in the 1A with the provisional ballots, but will now come back in the number 8 envelope with the other forms that we can start looking at on election night. So that's the change there. But again, it'll all be written down, it'll all be on the checklist. You don't have to remember a word of what I just said for that, or honestly for a lot of these other things we've talked about today, because we'll have them covered in either the chief's briefing and or the chief's notebook.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Also,
Sure thing.
I'm the new chief for 934 Fox Valley.
Oh, terrific. That's another one of our brand new precincts. I'm really glad to hear and see that. Oh, that's fantastic. And actually
Richmond,
for
I wanted to follow up on that poll pad question. There's actually a screen that you get to at the end that says voter ABC processed successfully. So when you're monitoring your voters, your election officers at the beginning of the day or a shift change, like Jean Faubo was saying, you want to make sure that they're getting to that processed successfully screen.
And I'd like to add to that, there's a during the day guide that you will put at your check-in table that has the list of the steps that every election officer will use for every single voter. And it has a picture of that final process successfully screen that reminds them that they have to see that screen before the check-in is finished. So they don't have to remember every step. It gives them what they say to the voter and the exact sequence of check-in steps they must follow. And you should make sure that guide is on your check-in table for your officers to use.
Okay, thank you.
Great. All right, Calvin.
Yeah, just a quick question. When do you recommend that we reach out to our polling place for that initial contact, for setup and finding our grade card and such?
So all of those things that you have to do, contacting your polling place, contacting your election officers, coordinating with your co-located chief if you have one, that's all in the last 2 weeks before the election, before election day. And that's when we'll send you an email with all the details you need for all of that. So right now, the only thing you have to do in September or early October is to make sure you've completed any required training. So as all of you as chiefs, if you are a first-time chief, to make sure you've watched the Chief Basics class and taken the required quiz for that. That's the only thing you have to do right now.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem. All right, David, you are officially our last question. Go ahead.
It's not a question, Robbie. Thank you. It's just a comment. In that training session, the equipment familiarization session this week, I got paired with a first-time election officer who was eager and trying to learn how to use the poll pad there. And she wasn't following the checklist real carefully. And she actually did what we've been talking about here. She clicked the submit button, but never got to the, she clicked the accept button, but she never got to the submit button. And then when we were going to move on to the next ID, she hit the start over switch. And so I think that's what constituted the example that they talked about in the session, where there was an instance where the poll pads were 50 numbers off from the DS200s because people weren't doing that. And I think they were hitting that start over button. So I totally agree with all the great advice we've been getting here for us chiefs to, at the start of the day, watch these election officers when they're first getting on those poll pads and make sure that they're carefully following your checklist. And we may need to check our checklist to make sure that they've very explicitly listed all the steps that need to be taken. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks for that, David. And, I should say that the wording on the poll pads, we wish we could change it, but when you make a change, it actually has to go through a state certification process that can take about 2 years. for the poll pads and just electronic poll books in general in Virginia. So that's why we can't just, change the wording on that button like we wish we could. So with that said, like I said, Dave was our last question. If anyone else has any questions that we haven't gotten to, feel free to give us a call in the office. Feel free to send us an email. We got plenty of staff here that are very happy to answer your questions and help prepare you before Election Day. This is the first general election in 8 years when all of our chiefs will now represent the Republican Party because of the change in the governor. And that was a challenge for us as office staff, just assigning folks and making sure we had enough folks willing to do it. But I'm very excited. It means that all of you, I think, are on your toes, right? This is your first time being a chief ever or in a while. And it means you're really paying attention to what the latest procedures are, what the latest laws are. And I'm very confident that all of you will have a great election day. So with that said, and on behalf of all of our wonderful staff here in the office, Alina, Abigail, Kurt, Jenny, Nazila, Gilly, Linus, V, Jean, and Jean, we thank you so much for being chiefs, for joining us today for this question and answer session. And we look forward to seeing you all have a wonderful election on Election Day, and also to see you either during the chiefs briefing or during the Q&A we do for that the week before the election. So thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and we'll be in touch again next month.